Help capture the history of our markets by contributing to the John Lothian News GoFundMe campaign to support the Markets Wiki Education history-focused video series and more.
From barchart.com, which serves over 2 million users per month, to market data and technology solutions for commodity, financial, and media businesses, Barchart connects you to the markets.
I got my start in the market when I was working at a hospital part-time, going to my undergrad program at UIC. And the individual who was a manager left the hospital and became the employment manager at the CME. And this is back in the mid-'80s. And at his going away party, I said, if there's ever anything down there that looks good, let me know. I'm always looking for, something better. I was paying my own way through school, and he called me a couple weeks later and said, we have these jobs down here that, you come down and you stand in the trading pit and they scream and yell at you and you put the prices up on the wallboard, and they have tuition reimbursement and it's a decent hourly wage and it's part-time. You'll be out of here early in the afternoon. So I said, sounds good to me. I had originally started school. I wanted to be an attorney, and I was in my undergrad program, and I walked on the trading floor with him as part of the tour after the interview. And the minute I walked in the trading floor, I'm like, this is it. This is what I want to do. And so I got my start there as a market reporter. And then I moved over into the regulatory area, into compliance at the CME. And ultimately, I left the CME and traded for a short time in the S&P pit as a local with my own money. Didn't do that well, not well enough to make it as a trader. And I left there, went over and worked for a firm for a couple of years at the Board of Trade. And then I ultimately started working for the Board of Trade in 92 or 93. And I worked at the Board of Trade through 2007. And then I went on and worked for a couple of investment banks, worked for an industry regulator, and I now work for a cryptocurrency electronic exchange. Originally, they would bring the new hires on the floor for market report and have you start in the Hog Pit. When I was in the Hog Pit in the mid-'80s, there were some people in there that were filling orders. A gentleman by the name of Terry Delphi was one of the order fillers. I stood in front of and quoted the market. Several other of the names that people would know of today. And I was there a couple of weeks, and the pit supervisor from the cattle pit, which was a bigger, busier pit, went to the individual who was conducting the training and said, I want that guy in the cattle pit. So they brought me to the cattle pit, and I was a market reporter there. And after about 6 months in the cattle pit, they approached me and said that they were looking for people to work after the cattle close in the S&P pit. And the S&Ps closed the cattle pit closed, I think, at 1:00. And I would then go at 1:30 into the S&P pit, and they would put me up on the podium at 2:00, because at 2:00, when the bonds closed at the Board of Trade, is when the S&Ps would really start to kick off for the rest of the afternoon through the 3:00 close of the stock market. So I would be up there, and that was just like trying to navigate just a massive sea of people, hundreds of people in the pit, and trying to make heads or tails out of who was doing what. I enjoyed every minute of it. It was an exciting environment. It was very busy. It was loud. But surprisingly, to outsiders, it looks to be very confusing. Surprising, I always found the pit to be one of the most controlled environments, where all the screaming, yelling going on in any specific area, the pit was always only at the best bid and the best offer. So I think, unlike electronic trading, as we'll get to later, you can see what's called the book, where you can see all the orders up and down. You could only see and hear the best bids and best offers in a trading pit at any given point in time. So that was all the same screaming and yelling at the same price points by every person in the pit. I was actually standing in the S&P pit when the Challenger exploded. I was in the S&P pit for the '87 crash. In fact, there's a small snippet of a photo in, I think, Futures Magazine, where I'm standing in the bottom of the pit, quoting the market as the market crashed in '87. I was standing in the pit when Harold Washington passed away. Actually, the day before Thanksgiving. I think back in '87, it was right after the crash, and all of the hush that happened to the floor, and then suddenly reality would set in that we're still trading, markets are still reacting, and now we'd have to also react, and things would start to kick back on. I met some really excellent traders in the S&P pit and in the other pits as well. People who had no college education, who could stand in there and had a risk appetite that you can look at and think, I can't believe they're doing that. And other people who I knew, one individual who had an MBA from University of Chicago, came in there with his nice white shirt, nice tie, and he had taken all the economics classes he needed and knew everything about the markets and just wasn't cut out for the pit. Probably like myself, I didn't make it in there. It took a special breed of person to make it in the market. When I was hired at the CBOT, I was hired in OIA, and I was hired to be a compliance person for OIA. I was there a little less than 9 months, and I was tapped by a group that was now starting to do Project A. And it was Project A, I'm going to call it Project A, the reboot, Project A Phase 2. The original Project A, they traded a couple of contracts, I think back and forth, maybe 2 or 4 contracts of barge freight. They had decided that as the CME had launched Globex, I think in 92 or so, that the Board of Trade now in 93, 94 wanted to have a system where they could compete and offer their products to people electronically. So they launched Project A. I was brought on board to run the overnight shift originally, but not having either shift up and running, we had to continue to market the system, build our support systems and everything in preparation for going live. So when we did go live on Project A, we went live with a hardwired connection to each individual terminal. So there was no internet access to these devices. There was no running over corporate infrastructure for people. It was a direct connect to us. Terminal operators be certified with us on training before they could get access. And the first trade was a young lady at one of the firms who had put in an order in the spread market. And in the treasury bonds, the markets trade in 30 seconds. So they trade the spread price is always quoted in ticks, not in points. Well, the system had been designed by IT folks, and they had done a good job of building a system that did what they designed it to do. And one of the things they asked it to do was, when you're quoting these spreads, do the mathematical difference between the full price of the bond. So for instance, if a bond's trading 108 and the next one's trading 106, in trading speak, that's 64 ticks. But in math, looking at it totally, it's 108 minus 106 is 2 full points. So they put it in as 200 in the system. Well, this young lady had put in an offer on the other side of the trade, and it had resulted in having something like 21 different counterparties participate in a 200 lot trade as our very first trade. It was an error. It was about 5 points off the market, 4 points off the market. As everyone in the control center for Project A was cheering about it, I kept looking at it and I said, wait, guys, something's wrong here. This is not right. The math doesn't work. And they kept saying, no, it works. Look at this. I said, no, but that's not where the spread went off. The spread went off at like 61 bid at 63 on the floor. It can't trade 200 ticks. And I wrote it on a big whiteboard and I said, look at this. And then finally the light bulb went on, like, oh my God. So we had to invoke an error trade as the very first trade in Project A. We had to call all the counterparties and tell them that we were taking the trade back from each of them. I had one individual who I contacted and said, this is what's going on. The spread went at 61, 63, whatever it was on the floor. You've obviously sold it at 200 ticks. It's a bad trade. We need to bust the trade. And his response was, well, you can't bust it. I already laid it off. And I knew enough, and I knew him well enough. I knew if I said, look, you and I both know there's not another market where you could have laid it off. And he kind of laughed, goes, yeah, you got me there. So the trade was busted, but that was my experience for the very first electronic trade in what became the last of the Project A iteration going forward when the Board of Trade did the electronic trading. And then it moved on to Alliance, CBOT, ErisX was involved in different iterations, and ultimately everything went to Globex at some point. But when we launched the overnight session, we had issues with grain products where you had something that traded on the floor of the Board of Trade during the daytime, and people would then take their book and pass the book as they do now, but they would pass the book then to another area to run their overnight operations, and they would input the bids and offers from the daytime session on unfilled orders. And if an order was in the system that was way off the market and someone came in and decided they wanted to buy something and just put in a market order, they could theoretically move the underlying market from the daytime out to this bad price because there was no other offer in the market. That's all there was. And there were times where that took other parts of the market out of line. We would have to then get people on the phone in the middle of the night and say, this is what's happened. That for instance, corn was trading at this price on the floor. Someone's now bought a corn contract at 15 cents or 12 cents off the market, which is at the limits. And, we think that's a bad trade based on today's trading on the floor. And that's when the primary market was obviously on the trading floor. So there were trades that were busted for those reasons. And, it wasn't that common. As you got more liquidity, you had less of that happen because then there were bids and offers at different levels. We had access to a whole group of people through a call tree if we had an issue. We generally would have people who we would call at nighttime on our air trade policies who were actually up at night on the firm side. If we had to call and have someone talk to us about, is this trade in or out of line? But if we had a system issue or we had a big enough air trade or we had some problem where we were really experiencing difficulty, yeah, we would page someone or we would pick up the phone and we would get people out of bed. And my job was to manage things as best I could without making that happen. And hopefully Tom didn't say I called him too many times. But yeah, there were definitely times where we had to call and get people out of bed. As I was working on Project A overnight, I was contacted by Tom McCabe and Brian Durkin that they were putting together a group that was going to start to do order routing into the trading floors. So they were trying to improve the efficiency of the process on the trading floor and continue to be able to use the expertise of the people who were doing the business on the floor. Because you had a tremendous wealth of people on the floor filling orders who could understand if you got an order and the market was moving one way or another, if it was something they wanted to take part in or not, based on their experience, if it was an anomaly, and the money you paid to a floor broker to fill your order got you that expertise. But the issue wasn't that expertise. The issue was the process of getting that order out of the floor and mitigating the risk of clearing that order and getting a notification back to the customer. TOPS has been around forever. TOPS had gone to these printers on the floors of the Board of Trade and the CME, and the CME had built CUBs, which I think is Common Universal Broker Station is what I think it stands for. And they were electronic and they were in the pit and they had some orders going to them, but the majority of the orders that they got coming in on the TOPS system, which is trade order processing system, came in on printers. They tore them off the printer, they walked them in the pit, and they put them in the deck with the rest of their paper orders, and that's how the broker did their business. The CUBs orders came in electronically, went to the terminal in the pit. They were able to fill the orders on the pit, sort their deck, set things up, but they had a paper deck, and then they had the deck on the screen. So because the majority of business was on their hand in the paper deck, there was more of a tendency to say, I really don't want to deal with the electronic stuff coming into me on that screen because now I have to look at two things and I can't, I'm going to have to merge those two things together. So it was a tough sell. We ran into the same issue on the Board of Trade side. To help with some of that, the Board of Trade built the electronic clerk, which was the device that was in the pit. Originally, it was hardwired in the pit. Ultimately, we went wireless with those devices, and you could be anywhere in the pit with it and not have to be tethered to a physical stand, a clamshell, and a steel pole on the ground. We also built Comet, which was, I think that was Common Order Management Entry Terminal. And the Comet device sat in the desktop. It was a hardwired device that had a touch screen on it. You could do flashed orders, you could do market orders, you could do all the different order types. It didn't maintain any data from day to day, but it was what you could do on people that called in on the phone and said, I'd like to buy or sell something in one of the pits where we had an electronic clerk. They could tap on that screen, send it to a specific broker. The message went to the pit. The broker could then turn around, execute the order, give his clerk the order when it was filled. The clerk could put the endorsement information in the electronic clerk, and two things happened. The order immediately went back to the desk and said, the order's been filled. Here's who the buyer seller was. Here's your price. That same order then also went to clearing. So we would have a trade in the clearinghouse and in the firm's back office in a matter of minutes. You could stand on the floor on the phone with somebody and ask them, this just happened. They could tell you within minutes if they saw the trade in their back office. So this alleviated a lot of the risk of a piece of paper that somebody had to have in a deck. You had to write on that order. You had to take that order upstairs. Somebody had to manually key punch that order and then keep the order in a file folder, whatever, up on the desktop. If you had a problem tomorrow, bring all those paper orders to the floor, look at all the paper orders. This you could print reports out of. You could, the electronic clerk allowed you to bunch orders together. So you could have 50 market orders come in the morning, you could have 50 pieces of paper. EC grouped them all together. So you could have a 50 lot order at the market to buy in the open. You could fill it at one price if that's what the trade was done at. And all of those confirmations would go back simultaneously, all at the same price, all back where they came from. And it helped a lot with managing the deck on the floor. And there were times where as we started to migrate more and more business to these machines, firms became more and more enamored with having their customers have direct access into the pit. Instead of calling their desk and canceling replacing orders 6 or 7 times, they could do all of that via the machines. They could sit on their desktop at home and they could put their own order in and they could see the order go in the pit. They could get their fill back on their desktop, and there wouldn't have to be all of that interaction that really wasn't a value add. And I think that's what the best part of what it did was, is it allowed direct access in and out of the pit. It allowed for the expertise of the broker to fill the order, and it allowed for all of the rest of the things to be done by technology. Being a giant trading floor, I think the grain room was 30,000 or 40,000 square feet, and the bond room was 60,000 square feet. The traction that was gotten by electronic clerks and by Comets and the use of those was primarily in the grain room, because that's where you had the majority of orders. You had the volume of transactional volume done in the financial room, but you had all of these small orders in the grain room. So we had to figure out how to wire the grain room so we could have wireless, because putting these things in the pit took up a person's spot where they could stand. So if you stood outside of the soybean pit when we first started putting these in and really ramped it up, you would see something like 15 to 20 of these machines. Well, if someone's standing in a very busy area of the pit and that's where their spot is, where they're filling orders, we couldn't necessarily disenfranchise someone and say, you need to move out of the way because we need to put a machine here. And now he's going to have a clerk here and another clerk here. And pretty soon we've got 4 or 5 people standing there in that pit in a spot that should be there for someone to make a living. And so we decided that as the floor really pushed it more than anything, they needed to have the flexibility of being able to move, needed to be able to be somewhere else. So if my clerk had my machine, they should be able to be outside the pit checking my trades and making sure that all of my things are clearing. So we developed Wi-Fi technologies on the floor, which in the initial stages, like any other new technology rollout, there were some issues. I think we refined a lot of that. I think it ultimately worked very well. And it allowed the clerks to have wireless access and be able to go around and do their business. And what that then allowed was, once we started to put the products onto the screen and allow people to start trading products on the screen, is we were able to put the applications on those Wi-Fi devices. So we had a small GUI that the Board of Trade developed that we gave to the members to use, much the same as I think the CME Group uses Galaxy. The Board of Trade had another system that we used. I think it was just I don't even remember what we call it, to be honest with you, but it was a GUI, and they could access the ladder and they could do whatever they needed to do, buy and sell, just very basic functionality. If you wanted more functionality, you would go to one of the vendors at the time who was out there, TT or CTS or one of the others. What that allowed is by the Board of Trade putting in the Wi-Fi infrastructure to allow for electronic clerks and then ultimately handheld trading cards for individuals to put their trades into as well, is it allowed for that same support then for adding into the Board of Trade's basic GUI to trade side by side if you wanted to do that at no cost for the application, or you could then use the other infrastructures that was all put together and let that happen. It started to let people see that it wasn't the flavor of the day thing. It wasn't just like, well, we want to try something, see how it goes. This is happening. This is real. We had to put up screens, plasma screens in the pits, so that people could now see the electronic market, because there was sometimes more activity in some of the electronic markets than there was in the pit. In the initial stages, when they first went side by side, the majority of the business was still in the pit. So you could look up on the screen and see what was on there. And it was more of, I don't want to call it a distraction, but people kind of out of the corner eye watch what was going on. But then as things started to migrate to the screen, and it happened very quickly, people started to think that, well, now I kind of need to have, I guess, one foot in the pit and the other one needs to be in the screen. I need to have access to something. So, looking at those screens, people started to get their electronic devices, and there were very few people on the floor who were now walking around that didn't have some form of electronic device hanging around their neck wireless, that they were accessing the electronic platform while standing physically in the pit and perhaps also making trades. You could probably still find some today who preferred to have their things executed in the pit, because for the $1.25 or $1.50 or down to 75-cent brokerage that was being paid, you could hand off that risk of execution to a broker on the floor. And if the broker didn't do what they were supposed to do, then the broker had to pay the difference for that, all for his $1.50 a contract that he got. Instead of me as the customer, it's all my risk. If I hit the wrong button or I miss something, it's all on me. So there were still customers who would have, special types of orders they'd want done that were more complicated strategies than they really wanted to have them and take on for themselves. So some of those remained in the pit. But the majority of straight orders just started to migrate to the screen, and then the people that were on the floor, who were brokers who no longer had any business, needed to find something else to do, and the locals had to adapt to being able to trading to the screen. And some were able to do that, and some not. But I think that's really what changed it. The Ace to Life Connect, the fact that these things happen closely intertwined at the same time, you usually don't want to fight a two-fronted war. But I think that in this case, that was really the only option that was available. So removing from the alliance with ErisX and then moving over to Life Connect was a whole team of people who had to take the infrastructure and had to take all of what rules and regulations and make that work now with yet another foreign country who's hosting their items for them in London instead of in Frankfurt. And that whole process there was a project in and of itself. The clearing thing, to me, made perfect sense. To be able to have all the trades clear in one engine, CME Group had capacity in their clearing side. They had a very good clearing system. I worked really closely with the people ultimately when this was being put together and when it was done, on how our trades had to be processed, how our expirations for options worked, how all of the things that worked within the systems, and how our systems on the Board of Trade side, both from order routing and electronic trading, how those messages had to go back and forth. I learned a tremendous amount that no one ever taught me about how all of that works, because we did trial by fire. And I think that when the conversion happened to the CME, we had a little bit of a hiccup towards the end of the Board of Trade engagement, where the Board of Trade had shut down one evening, or we hadn't gotten files, and it was pandemonium the next morning. So, of course, conspiracy theorists surmised that this was a purposeful thing because we were leaving the BOTC. That, in fact, wasn't the case. But to everybody on the floor, the rumors fly, and they always say the floor may exaggerate, but it never lies. There's always some truth to whatever was being said down there. But once we moved over to the CME Group on the electronic side, things worked relatively smoothly. Over to Life. I think things worked relatively smoothly. I'm not aware of what caused that to no longer be the case, other than the merger of the two exchanges later on in the board of the Merc. But on the clearing side, I think it ran pretty smoothly. I did a lot of the options expiration work on the Board of Trade side, and we would have the people from the Merc come over during options expiry on a Friday, and they were amazed at how our out trades were so much less, and how we were able to communicate with the membership and the firms to clean these things up on a Friday. And a lot of that was because of the work that we laid forward with order routing and things, and you could see your trades and see if you had out trades before you left the floor, and you could clean it up. We had broker stations all over the floor for people. And I think that helped a lot to get those numbers down. It's interesting because I left the Board of Trade in 2007. So after the merger was done, I was retained to help bring the traders from the CME Group over to the CBOT floor, because as part of the merger and acquisition, then the CME now owned the trading floor in the building at the Board of Trade. And they wanted to put everything in one space instead of paying for two trading floors. And at that point, things were already migrating to the screen. So there was enough space to be able to put all these things in there. And you would have to do a lot of refiguring on the floor and things like that to make that happen. But there was space. I was brought on to be able to work with the people from the CME Group, the membership side, and the firms, because I knew everyone on both sides, from the CME and the Board of Trade side. As that was happening, I was working with the team that was doing the configuring of the floor. I was working with the pit committees and such. I was offered a position elsewhere. I didn't see myself as being long-term in being able to stay in the new organization at the CME Group. So I took an opportunity to go elsewhere at that time. When I went to DB, I was brought there to run their book of work, change management, and they had hundreds of projects out there. But some of the first things we had to do were to take a look at what type of capital outlay we had on the CME floor and the board floor. And we were now going to be moving to one floor. So we had to do some consolidation internally, like everyone else did, including the exchanges. And some of that consolidation happened. And then as we started to pare down how much open outcry business was being done on the new floor, once the combined entities were there, we basically ended up having to shut down all the groups on the floor. And then whatever options business we had left, which was really about all we had left to do, we were able to work with a firm that did our back end processing for us, that did our key punching and did our management of the orders on the floor for our customers. because we still had some people trading options, which were not migrated to the screen. And then shortly after that, I think in 2008, the CME Group acquired NYMEX. Same process there. Had to go through the same process now of moving those things, moving the people off, and then integrating NYMEX into our back end. So as the CME was going along and acquiring firms, acquiring exchanges, the back end side of this, and ICE included, the back end side of this was the firms were scrambling to try and make sure they weren't interrupting anything on back end for us to process. And that was really what I was kind of tasked with doing, is making sure we were still able to process everything. We've seen the race for bandwidth. We've seen the race for building data centers, bigger, faster data centers. People spending the majority of their budgets on IT. Didn't used to be that way. I don't think that's going to end. I think that a lot of the expertise out there about how this business truly functions is fading away. I think it's become more of a computer-generated quants, algos. People build mathematic models to make transactions based on some numbers. And it's not about how much it costs in carry for soybeans. What's the insurance? What's the cost for transportation? What does it cost for? And none of that is I think as well known anymore. And there was a camaraderie on the trading floor that I think people to this day miss a lot and are going to continue to miss. I mean, it was a lot of people down on trading floors, talking thousands of people. You got to know people, you got to know their families, generations of people, and working with the firms. I mean, I worked with some wonderful people at some of the firms. We used to do mock trading sessions in the pit on the trading floors at the Board of Trade and the CME, but I can speak more about the Board of Trade ones. And we would have some of the firms bring down their IBs and would do mock trading in the pits. Loved doing that with people, loved having them get an exposure to what really happens in the pit. And it's something that being a part of it and knowing now that it's gone is the most surreal thing I think I can think of. That 20, 25 years ago, you could never have said to somebody, there won't actually be people standing in a pit anymore, screaming and yelling and making trades. No one would have bought that, but here we are.
John Lothian News would like to thank those individuals who have contributed to our Markets Wiki Education GoFundMe campaign. Their financial assistance allows us to produce and distribute videos like this for our Open Outcry Traders History Project or the Path to Electronic Trading video series. Join them in supporting John Lothian News, capturing the history of our industry.